All right, WoW Classic Plus. I want to break down some of the big key groups that I'm really focused on, as opposed to like the general design philosophy of what makes classic classic. I think plenty of people who are popular in the classic genre, you probably can think of some of them, like Mad Season and these sorts of folks. Generally, they've got a good breakdown on that. I don't think I'm going to be able to add anything on that front, but instead I want to talk about WoW Classic Plus, what we might want to see. And so we can look at this as you have races, classes, items, questing and leveling, dungeons and raids, and world events. Like these are some of the broadest categories, right? So as far as taking the classes and races, right? Let's talk race class combinations. There's quite a few you could open up that really wouldn't be a big deal. And for example, everyone always talks about human hunters. Like, why can't you have human hunters? Doesn't really make any sense. There's other ones that are not like on the alliance side. People don't think of night elf paladins, but what's funny is there's actually a quest where you basically encounter a something like that going on, and also if you can have a night elf priest who's using the holy light, even though that's kind of supposed to be lore wise something else, it's sort of like, why couldn't they also be paladins? Doesn't really make sense. um, but then you could also be like, well, shouldn't the Forsaken be able to be paladins then too? And you're like, yeah, some stuff is a little bit arbitrary. um, in general, I don't think this is that big a deal, but yeah, just open a few up. I would lean towards opening more options. Just obviously you can't do with the ones that are really anti-lore, but most of them it's like whatever. No one really cares that much. Playable races, I think in some of those things where people were getting a survey, they were talking about the races they added in the future. Almost every race they add in the future that isn't like a subtype of the existing races tends to be kind of weird and not really work, in my opinion. I the only I've basically, in short, I've looked through all these. The only ones that really make sense to me for putting into a classic context is high elves, slash blood elves, whatever you want to call them, same race. And the funny thing is, in the classic context, you could actually have high elves for the alliance and blood elves for the horde, and it would still make sense, because there's always been a group of high elves that remained loyal to the alliance, right? So if you wanted to do that, most of the other races don't really make sense. I've seen some people talk about furbogs. I guess I don't really know what it would add to the game, but people like their furbogs, so I'll be honest, I don't really care that much. But I don't. I'm a little skeptical of it, but like whatever. As far as then the other one people say is goblins, and maybe it's just me. I don't like goblins as a playable race. I don't think it's a good idea. I always thought gnomes were already pushing it because gnome warriors just like don't make any sense, and you can only have so many immersion breaking things going on. Like when you have too many people who are 1/10 the size of their sword running around, it gets a little bit like what? But hey, that's just me. Um, for classes in general, don't add any more classes. I think it's worth pointing out that Wrath of the Lich King is the peak of classic, and people go, that must mean it's good, and you're like, well, the problem with peaks is then they go down. Um, so I think it's pretty telling that there's things like that, like new classes that are the downfall of it. Basically, you already have tanks, healers, DPSs. New classes are just slightly novel ways to do that, and if you really want to make novel ways to do tank, DPSing, and healing, you can already do that through existing talents, modifying them slightly or modifying abilities slightly, or often what would work too is you have things like item sets, or as I think you should move those onto other items too, but you can modulate these things through other means. You could even add more talent trees. I just think every time they add classes, it's more stuff that they have to worry about and balance. I think it's better to just not go into more classes. But you do, I think, want to change classes in Classic, and people. There's a couple things. One, balance is one of the most overrated things people talk about. I get that it's important in PvP, but PvP will always be a more niche part of the game, and even like high end PVE, they're all no matter what is the best. They're all going to gravitate towards that. So there's always someone's always going to be on top of the mountain. So however you tweak it, they're all going to go to the. If you're trying to push the absolute limits of whatever you're doing, speed running, parsing, you're always going to go to that stuff anyways. So it doesn't really matter that much. What you really just need is for classes to be viable. And in Classic, it's like, oh yeah, Shadow Priests and Boomkins and Ret Paladins. Like you can think of a few things where you go, yeah, you just need to just tweak it so that they're viable, so that the normal player base doesn't have to feel bad about like wanting to play that and bring their friends along. Nothing in Classic should be so difficult that you have to min-max that hard. So there should always be space for that, especially in 40-man raids. But even if you decided, we're going to make it 25s, which I think is a mistake, but if you decided to do that, you should still be able to leave room for those. As far as changes to classes, look towards Burning Crusade and no further. I think it's the changes again, Wrath is the peak, and then it goes down, right? And then everyone says it's because of Cataclysm's fault, and you're like, no. Everything Cataclysm does is basically started in Wrath. What do you see? Everything's raid wide. Everything's homogenous. I'm not talking about removing quality of life features like making it easier to throw up your big buffs and that sort of thing. Anything to make that make more sense is like, cool, do that, sure. But as far as like having all your stuff be raid wide instead of group wide, making classes more homogenous, really just erodes all the identity of everything, and just everything's redundant. It seems to me like every time they go that route, things start becoming less interesting and less fun and less classic. So I would just avoid that. I'm not saying you can't pick through everything in later expansions for ideas. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I would lean towards the design philosophy of Classic and TPC for how to make things viable. Also, you can take existing skills that classes have and just make them a little more useful. For example, Thunderclap on Warriors is an ability that is broadly only useful when you're stacking debuffs on bosses. And it basically, even if you are tanking like a dungeon, you might press it, but it's kind of a waste of rage. Like you're better off just tabbing and sundering different targets for threat, right? So there's abilities. I'm sure every class has abilities like this, because obviously in Classic I mostly played Warriors. Every class has abilities that are basically useless or underutilized in some way. That as opposed to being like, oh, we need to make these crazy big changes to everything, it's like just make it so that those buttons are actually viable to press for more than just for kicks. Like anyone who's ever leveled a warrior is always like, oh yeah, it's kind of fun how within my first like 20 levels, I barely have anything to really press, and like Sunder Armor is often my best button to press, but it's like the most unsatisfying button to press. Like retail version of the game basically gives people too many buttons to press, especially too early. And Classic is like gives you the buttons they give you to press often early on just aren't very satisfying. And it's like you just tweak the numbers a little bit so they actually do something without making them overpowered or anything like that. And I think you'll have a much funner early experience. But like Season of Discovery shows that like you just give people overpowered buttons and it's not really satisfying in the same way. Like the funnest thing low-level warriors get to do is when you get a heavy weapon and you start hamstring kiting, and that's kind of satisfying. I don't know all the other classes, but that's the kind of stuff I would be looking at. Very minor tweaks, broadly speaking. And again, TBC and vanilla is where you should be looking. Racials, I think this is one of the most important things. Like if you barely changed anything else, I think racials are one of the big ones that actually need to be looked at. Obviously, everyone knows about the weapon skill thing, and I'm not really against races having the weapon skill. I think it's a little lame to be like pigeonholed into one particular race. But the problem for me isn't necessarily being pigeonholed because, oh, I want to do max threat and DPS as like a warrior, so I got to be human or I have to be orc. What I'm more annoyed at is that the other races don't have their own niche that make them good at something else. So the obvious one is like Night Elf has like the dumbest racials ever, like Wisp, Wisp form and Shadow Meld. Shadow Meld has like some niche uses that can be kind of fun, but they're the sort of uses that basically disappear. It's sort of like Wisp. Like Wisp has some utility when you're leveling, I guess, but like it just puts you in a natural disadvantage in every PvE and PvP scenario because everyone else has a way better racial. Or like, oh, so in the sense it's like I don't mind if gnomes are in a sense the best PvP warrior or humans are the best whatever warrior. It's more that can we just take all the really shitty racial passives and actives and just make them so that they actually do something? And if anything, I would even want to further differentiate the different races. Like, you even if that meant like actually increasing what their passive resistance bonus that some of them have to some stuff is, because like I think it's usually like 5 or 10 maybe. It's like really small. It's like why don't you just make that a little bigger? Like I think even more racial differentiation would actually be kind of cool. Like lean on that a bit. And I mean, there's so many ways to do this too. You could also make it where perhaps you can just shoot, like you have like certain core racial abilities that you have to take as the race, but then you have like minor ones that you can select whatever you want. And you could make that the weapon skill one. Something about that doesn't feel quite right to me, because there's something about having to make trade-offs like that, even if they piss you off, that's somehow still satisfying. It's kind of hard to, and also you can offset weapon skill issues in your game by just adding more items and more enchantments that can actually do weapon skill. So it's kind of like one of those things where it's like, hey, instead of just having edge masters that are super rare and super hard to get, without like grossly inflating it, just add a few more items that can cover that slot and then really narrow that margin. And you basically solve that problem anyways, which is why I think it would be better to instead give the different, just really lean into what makes the different races interesting. Like Dwarf Warrior Tank is clearly better in terms of overall threat production from your human warrior, but Stoneform does have some cool and useful things, right? Kind of like you're probably always going to go with an Orc Warrior Tank again because you're trying to max out threat production, but Tauren being a bit beefier is not nothing. So, in short, I would actually lean heavier into the differentiation between the races and buff the bad ones. Like with Night Elves, you could make. What if Shadow Meld was more like something you either active or passive that just basically could be procced or used to increase spell resistance? Or basically, I end up thinking of evasion and Cloak of Shadows from rogues. So maybe that's too much, but I don't know. I would lean into that. Yeah, and then is there anything else to cover on that? I think that's pretty good. If I was to say if you're going to add any races, I would actually think adding High Elves for both factions, essentially, I think would be cool, and would also give you the option you could probably take the TBC era questing zone and quest lines in the Blood Elf area, and with just a few, you wouldn't even have to tweak it that much to make it make sense for existing lore. It would only take a handful of quests and a bit of dialogue changes that honestly I think you could crank out in like a week with like one person writing that stuff, as long as they had it all in front of them. To basically do that thing where you start neutral and then have a chance to choose one or the other. I think that would actually be kind of cool. But as far as like where that is on my list, to be honest, it's relatively low. Even though I love the High Elves and the Blood Elves, but yeah. Anyways, so let's move on to questing, leveling. So as far as leveling and questing goes, and then you can kind of say the world, these all kind of exist in the same space because that's how you're interacting with it. It's pretty clear that you should add some new content, but more than that, I think you need to go to the existing content, clean it up a little bit, find some of the breadcrumbs and quest lines that kind of tailed off and never went anywhere, and give and expand them. So you don't necessarily need to create things whole cloth and new. In fact, I think there would be something more to like just making basically take the existing quest lines and flesh them out more. Because again, a lot of them sort of die off and go nowhere, and you sort of feel like, oh, I guess that was it. And also, a lot of them have unsatisfying quest rewards. Like you might do a really there's all these quests you'll get that are really tough, especially kind of at the time you get them. And even if you get a group together and do all the stuff and complete them, your reward at the end is like it's never worth it. So there's all these cool. There's actually a lot of existing content in vanilla that you end up skipping most of the time because it's never time efficient, and then there's no good reward at the end. So it's like every time you have something that's time inefficient but cool, you should get a reward that basically says like, yeah, this is still never going to be as fast to get to 60 as just powering along and just doing the normal questing, but I should get something cool that makes me like pretty strong or really novel for a period of time. And especially with leveling, it's like, who cares if again, it's like balance is super overrated. It's like, oh man, you got an item that's, it's like if I got Whirlwind Axe earlier than I should have, and you're like, oh wow, that ruins everything. And you're like, yeah, but if it took a ridiculous amount of time to get my hands on it, it's like, what does it really matter? And then like, it's not like it's going to break the game at the end game, or even super break it even within like 5 levels. You're like, yeah, it's really strong for like 5 to 10 levels or something, but like, it's not long before I'll find something better. Whirlwind Axe is a bit of a crazy example, I'm aware, the whirlwind weapons, but that's just kind of the area I'm thinking of that in. Then, of course, there's a bit of, I don't remember them off the top of my head. I know there's some areas of the leveling experience where maybe you kind of run out of quests to do, and so it really only makes sense to grind for a while. Sure, you can probably smooth that out, whatever. Something I think I would like to see is, it's not like giving anyone XP bonuses, but I would prefer to see ways to mitigate the XP demerit for questing in groups. One of the funnest experiences I've had, even though it was way more inefficient in a lot of ways, was just getting in a goon squad with some friends, and then everyone's just like drinking beers or whatever they do in their home to have a good time, and just powering through some quests in a goon squad is so much fun. But one of the problems you run into more than like XP demerits is all the quests that require you to loot certain quest items, especially if it's like you guys all need 10 raptor horns. So you're going to still have to kill so many of these bloody raptors, and the respawn rate's not that great. So there's a lot of and even if you're doing solo, that can be annoying, especially when the drop rate is bad. And that leaves you going, well, this was supposed to, these systems are here to make you grind a little bit because you need to grind some amount of XP for the leveling experience to work. But I don't think that's ever been terribly satisfying for people, and it just puts people at loggerheads against each other. And then you have hyper spawning or too slow of spawning. So I would, in general, I think people would actually rather just getting all their drop items, and then like if they still have to grind, I think they'd rather grind knowing they're grinding than grinding because they're waiting for that 10% drop rate. Oh, I only needed 5 of them, but I still had to kill 50 to get my 10. Like I don't think that ever feels good. And then I would probably make it too where if you're in a group with some people, like more will drop so that you can all just get one, so that you guys aren't you're incentivized to still work together. A lot of Classic has quests and questing areas where it's pretty tough to do solo depending on your class especially, and it always felt to me like they wanted you to do it in a group together, like you were supposed to be an adventuring party. But so many of these things like quest item drops, basically whether it's something that drops from a mob or you have to click and loot, put you guys at odds against one another. So that's what I would like to see changed, to basically incentivize people to want to get in groups more often, either pre-planned as friends or just right there on the spot, right? Um, I think if I'm thinking of the one that probably infuriated me the most, it was the, was it called the Curzan compound? Is that what it's called? I think it's the Apocalypse Now reference in Northern STV, where you have to kill these medicine men for pouches. And I do not remember how many I actually killed, but I feel like I was there for hours, especially as a warrior, because you have to be like, okay, I got to pick one out and do this, this, and that. Um, yeah, just, oh, really, I really hate that. So between that and maybe reducing the XP loss in groups, which I can imagine has its own problems, so maybe you can't do that. But I think if you just did the quest item thing, that would probably help a lot. Okay, I already pointed out that like long, awkward quest chains should have better rewards. Um, and to go a little deeper on that, for me, it's like when I level in Classic, and a lot of times I'm either leveling with just the intention of doing it as fast as possible, or I'm just kind of doing it in terms of like, I'm not trying to be inefficient, but I'm also not going to, like, I'm just going to do the quests I want to do and clear out a zone and just do it kind of the old fashioned way. And in that respect, I like finishing up quest lines, and I also like keeping up with my crafting as I do things, right? So I'm often not the most efficient leveler unless I'm specifically emphasizing that. But like I said, it's really annoying when your payoff for that is bad. So it doesn't always have to be just power. It could also just be novel or interesting. There are some quests. There's that one that people do to get that weird skull item that like gives you a speed boost and does damage to you, which gives it some PvP use because of how I think it puts like a dot on you or something, so that you'll break CCs that are put on you, or it's something like that. It's been a while, right? So you can think like, okay, item rewards don't just have to be strong; they can just do something cool or unexpected. Even something that just gives you a dash on a 3-minute cooldown is pretty cool, like on boots. I mean, we can literally spitball different kinds of items forever. Or like the missing diplomat is that one. Like it's one where, okay, it's fun enough to do, but again, like the reward at the end is like, what? It's not that good. Whereas one that has a really good, a pretty sweet reward at the end that usually feels good is the Defias one that you have to do over a long time, and then eventually you get, I think it's the Seal of Rin, if I'm remembering correctly. It's the blue ring. You're like, hey, this is actually a really good ring. You're going to use that for an insanely long time. Okay, then let's talk class quests. A lot of classes have pretty fun quests in vanilla. Unfortunately, a lot of them, and again, I mostly played Warrior, so that's what I know the most. A lot of them, you're like, what the hell? Like, this is a cool quest, and if I can do it, it's really cool. But like the ability, first of all, doing it is a real pain in the butt. Like, and it's never going to end up being worth it. You have a class quest to get this cool chess piece early on, but the kind of mobs you have to kill to do it and all this, it just, talk about super time inefficient. By the time you do it, you'll have gotten a comparable or better chess piece anyways. And that's kind of like Whirlwind Axe as well. By the time you can feasibly do it, you're already getting something completely comparable, which kind of defeats the whole purpose, right? And then these things also don't really have any kind of cohesive storyline to them. So I would actually look at Legion's class order halls for some inspiration. These have the big damn hero kind of trope going on, and Classic is not about being the big damn hero, most like generally speaking. You're more like the foot soldiers to the big damn heroes. So you don't want to go all the way. But as I recall, in Classic, Rogues have the SI7 stuff going on in the Alliance, and then Druids have their Cenarian Circle or whatever it's called. So you already have kind of this vibe. So I would just take it a little further and actually have kind of a through line of class quests that might actually have some pretty. Again, I'm always of the belief, hey, you want to put kind of weirder quests in there, a little harder quests, a little longer quests. Just give rewards that make it a payoff for that inefficient use of time, so you can be kind of strong for the next 5 levels. Like I've always said, balance highly overrated. Um, let's see here. Yeah, that pretty much covers my feelings on class quests. Basically, let's get more of them, and let's put a through line of story, so you kind of feel like you're becoming, going from being a nobody, like a beginner, to becoming like not. You're not going to be the head of whatever class order you're in, like not at all. You're just going to become like a normal agent, like, hey, I'm now a rank and file member. I'm a dependable person they can give a mission to. I'm not in charge of anything. That's where you want to be. Itemization. Classic has the best itemization in my opinion. It's wacky. It's weird. They didn't always know what they were doing. They had things like Hand of Justice where you can proc a random like weapon swing. And over time, everything became homogenous because it was like, well, we don't want warriors wearing leather. We don't want hunters wearing leather. We want everyone wearing the right piece of gear that they're supposed to wear for their class. And we want all the stats to make perfect sense and be easy, and then just suck all the fun out of it. So everything is just cookie cutter stat sticks. Also, something that that still infuriates me is how they don't put relevant information in the tooltips on items. Let's say I got, I think they upgraded it in SOD, right? So you have the Strike of the Hydra Sword, and I think the SOD one still does a similar. It's very different, but it's still a chance on hit to do X, right? There's all these items that chance on hit to do X. Trinket, chance on hit to proc X, and generally, if it's something that has a passive procking system, it has a chance to proc whatever that chance is, and then it has an internal cooldown, or things that don't have a necessarily internal cooldown, they have like a procs per minute. It can only proc so many times per minute. So there's all this relevant information that is just not given to you in the goddamn items tooltip. It's infuriating. It's like, oh, this random item, okay, let me go to Wowhead and see if somebody did a test on it and told me what it is. And you might be able to get away with that with all the endgame items that are going to get a lot of focus. But as you're leveling, any item in the leveling space that is basically has its item budget put into some kind of proc is just way less attractive than any item that is just a flat stat stick. Like if I have 2 swords that have the same weapon damage and the same attack speed and whatever else, but one has a chance on hit to shoot a shadow bolt and one has just like plus 10 strength and plus 10 agi, I'm going to go with the one that's plus 10 strength and plus 10 agi every single time, because the one that shoots out a random shadow bolt, I cannot factor that into like when I'm trying to kill a mob. There's no way to build a good intuition about how and when that's going to proc, and depending on what you're doing, and especially in Classic, that could mean life or death in what you're doing. So all that information, I think, should always be on the tooltip. And also, in a lot of cases, you'd probably be better off just making these active procs. So like if I had a sword that shoots a shadow bolt, and let's just say it can proc 4 times a minute, right? That's the procs per minute, and that's how it's going to proc. I would rather that it just either was an active use with a 15-second cooldown, or that it basically said every like 4 swings it shoots the thing. Either way, it's something that I can now plan around and find a way to utilize. Now it's something I can gamify. Now, in general, most of the items get blander and more boring over time, and I really wish after Classic they had kind of gone the other way. So what I would like to see is more just interesting effects in general. and we could literally sit here for hours and talk about them. But just a couple ideas. One is like I mentioned, with the ability to just know what the items are going to do and what the procs are and active use, so on and so forth. Um, I'd like it if just like the kind of random greens you could find in the world could roll some of these effects, just to spice up your leveling experience. I'd like to see some weapons just do some, instead of like having a proc chance on something to do an elemental type of damage. Maybe some weapons just do their damage to some percent as an elemental type of damage, which is kind of interesting, right? Because it's now, instead of that portion of your damage doesn't worry about armor but something else. Like, that's kind of interesting. You could have items that do some portion of their damage as bleeds. You could have items that proc other kinds of spell effects, proc more items that proc heals or barriers, frost novas, knockbacks, speed boosts. I mean, there's really no end to this kind of thing. You could also have more items that, like, after you've been hit X number of times, does Y. I'd like to see more thorn effects, like, some portion of the damage dealt to you is dealt to enemies around you, like in an aura, or after you get hit X number of times, it just does a reflecting. Because you can always cap this damage, or yeah, just more general thorn effects. Because all you really have is Demon Forge breastplate and Skull Flame shield. Shield spikes are super underpowered. There's a couple of random items that, like, is it True Silver Champion that can give you like the invulnerable bubble? So it's like every now and then you see something like that. There's some alchemy items that are a little more novel too. But I'll talk about that when I talk about professions. So, like, if anything, it's like also a lot of the cool effects on items have always been given to like the set bonuses on tier items. Sometimes it's on just the tier item, but it's usually a set bonus on a tier item. And that's when you get things that actually modify like a class ability and actually can change your gameplay. Like, oh yeah, now that I have this, I want to talent a little differently and play, and actually this changes the way I play the class a little bit. I'm sort of of the opinion that you should have more of those in the game as well. But again, I like wacky itemization, and I'd rather you leaned on the side of leaving people the ability to break the game and then go back and go, oh, okay, guys, that was a little crazy. Let's tone that back, as opposed to just having all these bland stat sticks. So I'd be a little more gonzo, if you will, with those sorts of things, as opposed to because like what I saw in SOD was like, oh man, these are crazy. These items are crazy, but all they still are is basically big stat sticks that you're just getting way too early on in the game, which just destroys item progression entirely. And it's like, okay. And on that note too, I'm not super big on giving people epic items at those low levels. It would have. I also don't think if you're gonna do low level raids like that, I don't know that you want to be slapping that many stats on things that early on in the game. I think it's totally cool to go through and take like items that are sort of objectively bad and make them more in line with other stuff. But again, I'd rather you gave them weird effects that make you consider using them in other situations. Like, again, it's go swing for the fences on weird keywords, if you will, and when things break, go back and fix it. Because part of what ends up happening is you basically just kind of have a boring leveling experience, and I think you'd have a lot more fun leveling not only the first time around, but other times around, if you could actually encounter items along the way that really can give you a different way of playing. You can, like, as a warrior, I can think of all kinds of these things that would completely change the way I approach different packs, but without being this super game-breaking thing. Like, if I know I have some kind of like sword and shield, like a shield that can proc a frost nova, even if it was like once every 3 minutes, I would have that thing on me, and that's never going to, um, even if it's set up such that like it can't work on a level 60 character. So you decide you want to make sure it won't mess with PvP in some way. When I'm out in the world, when I'm questing, I'm like, oh man, I can pop that, and then now I can take on a way bigger pack because I can split them up and do something, or like a knockback that can on some kind of mace or whatever. That means that I can kite two mobs because I can spread them apart from each other much better, or range pull much easier with like some kind of frost ability. Um, Obviously, and this is like the most basic stuff. That's why I also like the idea of things that's like after you take X number of hits, do some cool thing Y. Because that's the sort of thing where, oh, that changes my game plan again on how I want to deal with a pack. Maybe this increases my mitigation as I take more hits, and then all of a sudden that pops, does some damage, and I'm reset. And again, this is the most bland things I'm coming up with, but it's still more exciting to run into these kinds of items. I also think you should probably run into more BOE world drops, especially in the mid levels, like 30 to 45, 50. There's a lot of like BOE blues and epics that aren't really all that relevant to the game generally. And I'm guessing that even honestly, you probably won't be able to convince people to just use them, but I've always felt like if there was one thing I liked about hardcore, it was the idea that if that dropped, I just want to use that item, right? So that's kind of the thing where it's like you want to put people in a situation where, at least I think, where there's an actually good reason to just enjoy the item that you found and use it. Probably one of the ways to do this without disrupting the BOE world is just to make rare spawns a little more frequent and much more likely to actually drop something good, so that there's a reason to go out and find that rare spawn, and you're like, and that's a more normal part of your item progression, and it doesn't have to give you anything that breaks the world, but maybe you're like, oh yeah, that guy has that wand that does that weird thing. Hell yeah, and I got that. Oh man, there's that weird Worgen or in that weird spot in Ashenvale that's hard to find, but he's got that dope amulet. Um, Especially if you put them in out of the way places. So again, not necessarily time efficient to do, but worth doing just to get your hands on that cool item. And then it's BOP, and then you don't have to worry about the BOE market either. One of the biggest bummers is after TBC. So you go to Wrath and you're like, man, TBC crafting was pretty good. Like it was better. It's still engineering fucking master profession, like the master race. But um, let's see what you got in store for me, Wrath. And then Wrath is like, how would you like it if engineering is still the best, and then everything else is only a stat stick? And you're like, cool, great, wonderful, glad, glad I showed up. It's weird how you went backwards on the importance of crafting. That was weird. If anything, I thought TBC still didn't go far enough, because TBC crafting always had a couple of good things at different tiers. And let's say you were a weaponsmith, your Lionheart champion or whatever it was called was kind of like your best in slot for a couple of moments. But to me, I'm always like, why can't there just be a crafting item that's always my best in slot, even if it's just one of them? But some of that I can at least live with, especially in a 40-man rating environment. The fact that you can craft gear that's still in the ballpark of what the good stuff is actually way better than when it is in 25-man, because in a 40-man you have a lot more competition for certain kinds of gear. So your crafting gear being a little more up to snuff, even if still expensive and difficult to get, is way different. It's a way different ball game than even in the 25-man. But the real biggest sin of crafting is that all of your crafting progression is dog shit. Pretty much every item you can craft is a waste of time. Except like you could kind of say, if someone just handed you the materials, like the stuff you can get at low level and this sort of thing, like for an alt is like has some use. But if you go out and do all the crafting, get your skill up, get the materials, and get every crafting item you can at exactly the level you get it, if you are just like going through questing, you're basically going to end up with better gear anyways, or it just doesn't matter. And by the time you get to like level 20 to 30, you start basically running into the issue where the materials you need to craft the gear you want now is in a zone that's higher level than what you are. So by the time you can get the materials to craft that gear, you've already quested past the level of that gear. That's certainly the case for blacksmithing, and it's kind of the case for a lot of other stuff. I'm not entirely sure about leatherworking, but I wouldn't be surprised. Also, along the way, you don't have any other interesting side items. But pretty much the only one that kind of feels good most of the questing experience, if you keep up with it, is like alchemy, and even that starts to fall off. It's like just take the existing crafting recipes and just one, in general, lower the level requirements. A lot of them need their level. Some of them are fine. A lot need their level requirements lowered. Some just need their material component requirements lowered. A lot of them just need to be changed from higher level materials to lower level materials, and then a lot of them probably you just need to add some more in. But it's just nonsense that a lot of the gear you can craft along the entire way, no matter, especially the recipes that are like these world drop recipes that are really rare, and then the items they make are dog shit and have crazy requirements. I don't know if you've seen like the Frost Tiger Blade. It requires like an alchemy item, some other stuff, crazy, weird recipe, crazy hard to make, and then you just get a terrible sword out of it. Like you would never use it. The only reason you would ever get most of these recipes is because you want to have every recipe in the book for some reason. Even like enchanting at least has some different recipes at lower levels, but most of them are too weak to really matter, right? Like I don't know why minor beast slaying and other, like there's these niche enchantments like beast slaying that it's cool that they exist, but they're so underpowered for what they should be. Like why not just make it so that even a low level beast slaying enchantment has an outsized effect so people are actually incentivized to want to get their hands on it. There's almost nothing more RPG than being the warrior who's like, oh man, I actually have 3 swords with different enchantments for different situations. That's the kind of thing that I think is awesome about Classic. So I would again lean into that. I would go to all the, as opposed to going, I want to nerf engineering because engineering is too good. I would rather you go to the other professions and give them cool stuff so that people have a reason to not just have 30 engineers in their raid. Or rather 40 engineers in the raid. And that's like, give more of them unique things that they can do that are at least, they don't have to be the same thing as like, well, we'll just give them their own version to do a sapper charge. Give them their own special thing that's comparable. Maybe you can give blacksmiths the ability to put an extra enchantment on on a weapon. So their weapon can have 2 enchantments on it. Or an extra, they later on give them they basically try to combat this later, although it ends up just making them stat sticks, is by giving them like, oh, this guy can put an extra socket on it in later expansions. I'd rather be like, well, think about like shield spikes on shields. Why don't you just make it where they can do something way more interesting than something that's not as good as just getting a stamina enchantment on your shield? I would also want them to be able to, like, when you level blacksmithing, you eventually get to make mithril spurs and some other things, but their effects are super minor. It's like, just give them more cool stuff like that. Like, weapon chain's kind of a cool idea, but pretty limited utility, right? Like, these are the kinds of more in the space you want to go in. I'd have to sit down and really, like, write it all out to get more ideas, but again, if we just sat down and started brainstorming, we could do this all day long. If you look at alchemy, you'll see they actually have a lot of interesting potions that I wish they had higher level versions of, like Oil of Immolation. You do have Potion of Invisibility. Potion of Invisibility is good. Even like Troll's Blood Elixir, there's all these like regeneration, defense rating up. Like there's all these specific potions. And like talk about feeling like The Witcher if you can just drink very specific potions for different situations. So I wish there was more of that for sure in alchemy. Tailoring has bags, which is pretty good, and I'm sure just like leatherworking, if they just had generally better gear they could craft along the way, you'd feel a lot better about that already. But at least tailors can make bags, which is pretty big in classic, like early on especially. Leatherworking has like the armor kits, but again, don't you kind of wish that those armor kits had a little more? You could make different ones that did way different things. Then again, because I'm clearly someone who likes smithing and playing a warrior, so I'm familiar with those. I remember the Mithril, I think it's the Mithril Order quests. So there's this like long quest line you can do that's pretty cool, but like the reward at the end was like, what? This is it? And I know other professions have quests as well, but man, talk about an underutilized thing. Like really, I would go way harder on the profession quests and give them way more cool things to do. Another great way to differentiate different playthroughs, a great way to differentiate the different professions in a way to give them really cool rewards that maybe in some cases buff something they do in crafting. Because, every now and then you have like a weapon that gives you plus bonus to the skill. And that's kind of cool. And it'd be cool if they did other things too. Or it's like, hey, this quest line is long and you have to get your profession skill way up in order to do it. So it's very time inefficient. But hey, if you feel like maxing out what you can get at like level 30 in terms of your profession or whatever, maybe the reward at the end will make you kind of overpowered for 5 levels or whatever. Or yeah, really overpowered for 5 levels and then pretty good for another 5. It's sort of like, yeah, why not, Or it's just something really cool and useful. Like you could imagine like an alchemy one that just kind of gives you like a potion that refills. So you're like, yeah, I have a potion now. Like this one potion I have, I can just use it every 10 minutes or something, and it's just for free or whatever. Okay, dungeons, raids, achievements. Dungeons. I would say one of the biggest problems with dungeons and raids in general is the trash issue. This has been a problem in WoW forever. I don't understand what the thing is they will just basically put in, I don't know, 4 times more trash than anyone really wants to do. I would rather in general, you could drastically cut down the trash and just make it harder, right? I would rather you cut down the amount of trash, just made the trash that remains tougher, and stack more of the XP on bosses or something, which incidentally might also, if you're really worried about mage boosting, this would probably be bad for mage boosting, so you could probably do a lot to eliminate that part of the game if you think it's bad by doing this. Most trash packs are not interesting at all, if we're being honest. They're like, and they're also like really big. So you'll start running into all these trash packs where it's like there's like 7 mobs, and like 1 or 2 of them do something, and then the rest are just like, I stun you, and so you have to like CC some of them, and then tab sunder the rest. And it's like, it would be I would rather you looked a little bit more towards some of the TBC heroics to go, okay, why don't we give them a few novel abilities that actually make some of these packs a little more fun and interesting, and then just reduce the amount of them. Because like you can actually see in TBC heroics where like you might actually have packs that are kind of fun to do, but again, there's just like 2 to 3 times more than there really should be in the dungeon. And then it's like, oh, I'm waiting for this pat to go by. Okay, the pat goes by. I know it's going that way. Cool. Now I have to LOS around this corner and pull them all over here because of some fear effect that can go wrong. And I enjoy utilizing mechanics like LOS and timing pats. Like I like having dungeon knowledge and taking advantage of it. It just goes too far. The problem is like every dungeon has way too much of this. And it's like this means that all the dungeons have a very similar feeling to them in this respect, where a lot of them just feel, and raids too. Like a great example of this is Karazhan. Karazhan has so much fucking trash that you have to go through. I think most people, if you just eliminated like 80% of the trash in Karazhan without changing anything else, most people would have had like 10 times more fucking fun in that raid. And if you just made some of the hallways like half as fucking long. I feel like that was all that like say you can say nothing else about if you think the bosses are boring or anything. Like I think that's most of the pain in that raid, right? And that's true of a lot of dungeons too, where you're like, this dungeon would be way more enjoyable if it was just shorter and literally like, and if you just made it harder in some other aspect to, if you felt like otherwise it's too fucking whatever. Um, on top of that, you like a lot of like I mentioned in items, you really need to go through a lot of the dungeon drops and just tune them a little bit to be a little more like there's just a lot of items that are just not very good. So just go to all those and give them a little bit more love and give them a little more niche uses. Um, as far as like the overall difficulty, again, I don't think you really need to be looking to boost difficulty all that much in general. I don't think people are really playing Classic for a challenge, if I'm being honest with you. It's more because it's comfortable and feels good. So that's why you don't want to go too crazy on the changes because it still needs to feel familiar and comfortable, which is why I would, in general, just kind of lean on existing abilities. I mean, and if you add them into a dungeon, um, I think that can be fine. If I would actually look to, I think it was in hardcore, someone made an add-on that basically told you what every mob in the world does. And if there was a way to add that to the base functionality of the game, I would totally do that. Or I'd go to the add-on developer and be like, let's push this and make sure we have all the updated information in it. Because another problem I often see in Dungeons and Raids is like a lack of clarity in how mechanics work. This is as a pretty like mid player, and despite being a pretty mid player, I was in a guild that was able to clear everything in TBC pre nerf and was doing pretty good in Wrath before I dropped out. And I would be probably considered again pretty mid player at best. And there's plenty of stuff in TBC that were pretty challenging for me and took me a while to keep up with the rest of the guys. And a lot of that for me had less to do with the exact mechanics and often had more to do with the clarity of the mechanics. I would say, in my experience with a lot of raids in WoW, your problem is less these mechanics are too complicated for everyone to understand, and more they aren't actually that clear in the game. There's a reason people end up having to watch all these videos breaking down the mechanics, and that they can be kind of hard to learn yourself in the moment. And to me, this is sort of in line with my issues with how items require all this testing to know what they do because they don't make it clear in the tooltips. A lot of things in WoW are just not that clear because there isn't that much clarity in the mechanics themselves. You have very obvious things like get out of the fire, get out of the void zone. There's a lot of mechanics that depend on certain ranges and things that just aren't that intuitive for most players. And I think you can get the wrong impression from watching really legit gamers for whom these things become very intuitive. I've played this game for ages, and if you still told me to just use my cursor on the screen, right, and be like, hey, tell me what 30 yards is, I'd probably get it wrong 9 times out of 10. Besides, and I really do think going through a lot of the old raids and dungeons and tuning things totally fine. Especially in dungeons, there's quite a few places I think I would just buff item drop rates and buff the items a bit. One that always stuck out to me was in Zul'Farrak. There's an item you can get. There's actually 2 items, Jang Thrays and Song Thrays, that combine to create Soul Thrays. And that's really cool, even though Soul Thrays' itemization probably needs a little changing, maybe. But the drop rate on these is so low, where you go, what was the idea? Did you ever think someone was going to get this? Certainly never. They were never going to get this. Like at the there must have been maybe did one person ever actually get both of these drops in their leveling journey normally? I don't know. That just always struck me as odd. I'm like, this is a really cool thing that you basically said no one ever gets to do. Sort of like the epic items that drop off some of the uh, higher level dungeons, you know, like once you sort of 50 plus, what is it? I know there's one in, it's called Sunken Temple, right? There was that epic sword or something that drops. But the drop rates are so insanely low. It's kind of like the things that can potentially drop off Emperor Thorson, where you go, this is the time investment it would take to do this or get that sword, let alone the mount from Baron Rivendare. And I don't really care about the mount, but like the weapon you can get. This is just way too out of whack. This is just too much, especially with the amount of trash that you'll still find in these places. Then I also think like, why didn't you guys ever make more mega dungeons like BRD? I would actually, if you were to be like, what can you do to make BRD awesome? It's like, well, BRD is great. I would just have put in more shortcuts and more way. And in general, all the dungeons and raids need better maps to navigate them in game. I would even be like, hey, why don't you just make it where you do a quest or a cartographer's league thing, and you could make it a gold sync to buy better maps. I don't care if you really feel you need to. But mostly you just need a few more shortcuts so that it actually makes sense for people to want to go and do those runs. If it's too onerous and too time consuming, yeah, you're going to get people out of it. But if it's like, hey, we know there's actually some good shortcuts to just get to the end of BRD or to go to this part of BRD, and there isn't like 50 trash packs that I have to clear to get to that one boss, you know, then more people are going to be willing to do it. And I also wish there was more mega dungeons like that because it's so freaking cool. To basically even have like whole quest lines that are going on in there. It's like the coolest thing. And then they're like, oh, we're never going to do that again. And you went, this is why we like Classic better, guys. This is why we like Classic better. That's even one of those neat things they kind of did in Classic that, I mean, maybe it goes too far, is the profession stuff that's kind of like locked in a dungeon in some way. I always thought that was pretty neat. Or how you need to get that, is it the smelt elementium you get from mind controlling that one guy? Having those buffs you get from mind controlling stuff too, like these weird things you can get in dungeons and raids from mind controlling a mob or doing what is it, with the ogres to get those world buffs, Dire Maul. Classic has all these cool, kooky things you can do. That's the kind of stuff that's missing a lot of the times in later ones. And it's all about, again, everything's sacrificed on the altar of balance in raids. And this stuff is so overrated. Then we got, raids in general. I really don't think, again, in Classic, I would love to actually to see more raids added. I'm not, I guess, against these low-level raids they added in Season of Discovery per se, but again, they really screw up item progression, and I don't think, I think I would rather have seen more dungeons that are difficult, or if you're going to do that, as opposed to these raids, because it feels like because you make them raids, you feel like the gear needs to be so much better. And again, I feel like if you're gonna do that, then you have to completely redo item progression in the entire game. And I just think that's not worth it. I just think the amount of time and effort that would take versus if you just made it if you focus that instead on the dungeons, I think would be better. If you're gonna or if you just made the rewards really modest, like they're only slightly better, which might make people not want to do it. But otherwise, you completely screw up the item progression. And I just don't see that as being worth it in the end. I don't know what they've been doing inside because I stopped paying attention because it just wasn't doing it for me. I did not. It felt like retail. It didn't feel like Classic at all. So I dropped out pretty fast. So I don't know if they did like a Scarlet Monastery raid. That's the kind of thing I want to see. I'd love to see new raids, which is what I think they should do. There should be a lot more lateral progression instead of straightforward progression. And just like I said, Again, you don't always need to push sheer power on everything. You can also just push different and cool and crazy. Another thing they need to consider in with all their dungeon raid gear, if people like their original looks, that's totally cool. But I would say that you have to think about visual progression on characters. And one of the things I never really liked about later expansions is just how ridiculous a lot of the stuff became. I just think the gear sets get way too over the top. Um, wasn't often as big a problem for me as a paladin, although in TBC, some of the early ones I thought looked a little weird, but my Sunwell gear I thought was pretty cool. But some classes just get these outfits are just way too much. There's something to be said for like sometimes less is more. And some of the item sets, I'm like, just tone it down a little bit. Just pull it back a little bit. Let's get a little slightly more believable, maybe. I know we're talking Warcraft that's super high fantasy, but I would say you got to be careful with your visual progression. I do think it matters a lot more than people think that might initially think. And it by the time you basically hit level 60, you start getting to these super gonzo appearance progressions, which is part of what like I just think it's a bit like it's this ever escalating thing, and it just gets crazier and crazier. Whereas the initial visual progression you got from 0 to 60 was way more satisfying than everything that comes after the fact, if that makes sense. I think I would just really emphasize that raids don't need to push difficulty nearly as much as people think. I thought TBC raids pretty much push the limit of what you should expect from your players and the skill levels. I would never go beyond that. Um, and if anything, probably tone it down just a little bit. What you Having difficulty that breaks guilds is not good for your game. You want to encourage that, and you also don't want to have all these differentiated difficulty levels. Again, there's a reason Wrath is peak because it goes down. And that's why I hate so much. There's a reason I've dropped out of Wrath. I just feel like the design philosophy is it's really Wrath where everything goes bad. And one of those is having all these different rating difficulties. I would just no. There's only one. There's just this is the raid. Here it is, and it's fine if the best players in the world go, oh, I'm getting bored. I don't care. Then you can speed run, you can parse, you can do whatever crazy kooky things you want to artificially increase your difficulty. But you want to make it so that the vast majority of guilds can eventually progress it, and probably not too hard. Usually what ends up happening is good guilds start speedrunning. Good guilds are able to clear Hyjal and BT in an hour or whatever the hell they do, right? They clear Sunwell in 35 minutes. Whereas more normal guilds, they're like, hey man, that takes us our whole 4 hours to get through this stuff, and it took us a few weeks to progress that stuff. And we got one more boss down every week, and then okay, now it's been a month and we're full clearing, and then in another couple of weeks we're doing it a lot faster, and it took us getting more experience and more gear. That's fine, that's totally cool. Or even if it's easier than that, because most of the time what's important is not that everyone's becoming a min-maxed optimized super gamer. One of the things that's great about 40-man raiding is it's sort of necessarily easier and simpler, and people can just be comfortable and relax and have a good time, drink some beers and raid. That's why I do think less trash would probably make more people have a fun time raiding. And that's kind of what you should be looking, in my opinion, just my opinion, that's what you should be looking more towards with classic raiding, is remembering like this is supposed to be not too hard, comfortable, fun time, as opposed to like, look at how badass we all are. And people are gonna it's better to have a guild where some people are trying to parse, but like people will do their parse guilds, people will do these other things. But a normal guild that just has some people enjoying the game, they're nerds, they want to do their thing, they can get through all the content and not feel like they're lesser than anyone else, because they couldn't do the super special difficulty on the super special hard mode and get the super special gear. Um, and then on that note, so I'm not anti achievement per se. I just don't think it's good for World of Warcraft. Achievements are fun. I get why people like achievement hunting, but I watched it the first time around in WoW, and I watched it in Classic, and you can't. The problem is you can't separate this from everything else that changes in the game at that time. So there's no way I can't like run this experiment. But I'm pretty sure if you just added achievements to Classic, you would end up still seeing a lot of the same toxic behavior happening. It's also the same thing when you add item level to gear. You just have this like much more clear and obvious way to purity test each other that to me is just encourages the most toxic behavior in the game. And I just, in short, I don't think you should add achievements in game. I think it's better when the fun and what people want to do is player driven, as opposed to I want to get the internet points that I can show you and show how many internet points I have. Instead, it's like you and your guildmates just get together and decide to do weird shit just for fun, and it's a social experience as opposed to, all right, guys, we got to do super special hard mode on this boss so we can all get our special magic proto drakes. I sincerely believe that the endless need to get basically this bloat of cosmetics and mounts and all these other collectibles is actually really bad for the game, and especially when it's tied into achievements. I would just, if you're going to add mounts and things like this, I think it's better when there are very few of them. There should not be that many. You should not have hundreds and hundreds of anything like this in the game. If you were to ask me, I'd be like, every expansion should have added like one or two. That's it. That's it. Not very many at all. Keep it bare bones in that respect. I can't really justify this beyond just my intuition and my feeling, but I watched it happen the first time around, and I started seeing it happen in Classic, and I just lost all interest. My enthusiasm totally went away, and when I was just mindlessly leveling on my own, honestly, in Classic, I had more fun than all of Wrath. It's true. Sad but true. And also, people joke about TBC as the waiting room for Wrath. So maybe it's just me. I had way more fun in Wrath raids and in TBC raids and dungeons than I ever did in Wrath. And personally, my hot take is basically that TBC is, in many ways, is peak a lot of things in WoW. I still think 40-man raids, in many ways, are superior, and the 40-20 split I like. There's a lot about vanilla raiding I prefer, but and TBC also does make that problem of the 10 more levels, now you're over here away from Azeroth, kind of kills the old world. It does make that mistake. But it was never as bad as it later gets, oddly enough. And it does crafting the best, so there's just there's enough things that make me basically like TBC the best, but clearly I enjoy crafting, so always a bummer for me that it goes downhill. Then we can talk like world events. World buffs are really cool. I think that stuff's really neat. There's also the AQ event, this big cool event that's pretty cool. The Scourge Invasion, that's pretty cool. Then you have some smaller events like the fishing thing and Gurubashi Arena. That stuff's pretty neat. I think there should be more events like that. Monthly events, more regular ones too. You could imagine, for example, imagine you did introduce like the High Elf Zone or whatever. You could do like a monthly or weekly like troll event where the Zolomani trolls do a raid on the thing. And so it's kind of like the Scourge Invasion, but against the trolls. You could have more things like the Gurubashi Arena, I guess. Like you could add more things in this. One thing you got to consider is it would be a lot of times these events are kind of specific and time sensitive in a way that a lot of players just never get the chance to participate. I also, in that respect, I remember when in Hardcore they did this dungeon event that was really cool. I would have loved to participate in it, but I'm like, I do not have anywhere close to the time to possibly get involved in this. I actually think it'd be cool if Blizzard sponsored more events like that, that maybe had a setup that made it a little less onerous on time requirements that would allow players to participate in these kind of things. Blizzard sponsored events that were like, hey, you know, um, there's going to be, hey, take your time to level a new character, get them to this level, and then participate in something like that. Or, it's cool when it's player driven too. I do wish there was more ways, um, especially if Blizzard could get more involved in them. I wish there was a way to do it more clearly in game, and I wish there was a way to, again, make it something that more players would have the opportunity to participate in. Um, and then, of course, just more normal world events that can offer cool rewards. I would actually go through a lot of the rep grinds in the game and buff the rep rewards, as well as making the rep grind way easier. Most, in my experience, whether it's TBC or anywhere else, it feels more like artificial friction than something that I'm like happy to participate in. I think the less said about some of the rep grinds in TBC, the better. Some of those are just like, it feels like you're trying to hurt my feelings, and you succeeded. I wouldn't mind there being more big world events like AQ. I think maybe the AQ event, what it takes to get. I don't really care that some people have to go super crazy to get their Scarab Lord. I don't really. I think there's kind of a charm to that. I don't mind people doing that, or like High Marshal. And there's a sense in which I'm like, hey, you do you. That's cool. I'm not gonna do that, but I do wish there was more big world events that I felt like I could actually be a part of and actually get something good out of it. Most of the time, it always feels like when they do these and then maybe they include a catch-up mechanism, it always feels like it's way too undertuned to where I'm like, I don't really see why I'd bother doing this. Like, the catch-up mechanic you offer just doesn't really feel worth the time. Or it feels like this isn't actually accessible enough for me to do as a solo player to get to the point where I could join a guild because I would have decent enough DPS or whatever else, or heal, HPS, because the mechanic you put in place is like hard for me as a solo player to really participate in, you know what I mean? Or like to enjoy the catch up. So I really wish they would take a bit more time to think about that kind of stuff. And I always feel like they're doing this catch up thing and it's either like way over the top or completely terrible. And then all the rep grinds are so onerous that there is no reason why you'd always want to shortcut that step, because we're going to give you catch-up gear that's way better than all this rep grind stuff, so there's no reason to ever do that. And it's like, well, if you just made the rep grind gear better and maybe added more stuff to that rep vendor later on as catch-up gear, but then just didn't make the rep grinds so freaking insane, it wouldn't be that bad. That's kind of what like ZG was supposed to more or less do, and I guess it mostly succeeds. I still think that with most of those rip grinds, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like you could just chop these like 1/10 what it takes to do these stupid rep grinds, and I'd feel better. I've pretty much never. I don't know if I've ever felt good about a rep grind in WoW in my entire fucking time playing it. In all the rep grinds I've done, I don't know if I've ever been happy with doing it, if I'm being honest. So let me circle back and let's see if I can give more of a short list in terms of like what I think would be the sort of least effort but biggest bang for your buck. Because obviously I could sit here and be like, yeah, I want 3 more mega dungeons like BRD. I want you to give me the ability to have really cool shortcuts I can unlock in BRD so that I don't have to, if I wanted to actually try to farm Thorson, it wouldn't be completely insane. I'd love to have things set up to where people actually want to do these dungeons even later on and don't feel like they're stabbing themselves in the eyes when they want to help someone catch up in their guild, I would love to do that. We could do this all day long, right? But maybe it's worth trying to say, okay, what's like the biggest bang for the buck with the least kinds of changes involved, right? That don't require, that, might require editing items and a few things like that, but don't necessarily need a whole team to create brand new content and do all this, right? Like, what's the simplest things? Again, I think class changes. I would look to TBC and kind of flirt between classic and TBC and look at that for where you want to be with a lot of classes. Look to a lot of underutilized abilities in classes that really don't do anything, because they just don't really fall into a spec. And, try to give people anything that their rotation ends up being spam shadowable, try to give them a little bit more than that, but don't think you need to make complex rotations. I think it's basically fine if every class or some classes have one spec that's a little more complex than the others if you really want to go that route and give someone that option. But as always, I think complexity is really overrated. I think difficulty is really overrated. It just makes it harder for your average players to really be able to pay attention and have a good time, because it all becomes too difficult. So again, look between vanilla and TBC for the kind of level of where you want to be, of complexity, of the kind of talents that probably make the most sense. That's where I'd be flirting anyways. Still where you have very distinct class identities, you have very distinct group buffs, and there's still that kind of mini game of how you arrange groups. I think that's a pretty core part to how the game works. Just make it, as opposed to trying to undercut everyone who's doing having a good time. Just try to raise the floor. That's what I would do. I'd be more concerned about raising the floor than bringing the ceiling down. That's what I would suggest. For races in general, I would just take, like, Night Elves are an obvious one to me. I don't know if Trolls have any issues on the Horde side. I feel like the Horde races tend to actually have a very clear sense of differentiation in what they can do. Maybe Trolls are a little underpowered as warriors, maybe. That's possible, I'm not sure. Alliance side, Night Elves are the clear loser. Then you kind of have... you have a couple... Like, I feel like... Dwarves pretty good, yeah. Anyways, not the big deal. I would just look at the underperforming races, the ones who don't feel like they have a very clear and distinct role, and just buff them a little bit in the way in which they differentiate. I would look at all the passives that are a little, like, that barely matter, and just crank them up a bit so that those people actually have a place where they excel. Just get the fuck rid of Wisp form, please. Just, like, get rid of Wisp. No one wants Wisp, man. Please, just get rid of Wisp form. Make Shadow Melt something that actually does something. And either make sure there's alternate ways to get weapon skill that aren't completely insane, that but either don't invalidate a racial passive like weapon skill, or you have to, like, get rid of it. Personally, I lean towards the former, but whatever. And as far as adding races, pretty much the only races you should consider adding is probably just giving both factions access to elves in the terms of high elves and blood elves. Probably the only one that makes any sense. You can just as arbitrarily not let the blood elves have paladins as not letting the Forsaken have paladins. And if anyone says anything about it, the short answer is no one really cares. Don't give Horde paladins, and don't give Alliance shamans. If you want to play around with furbogs, I guess why not? I don't. It would actually be kind of funny if you add furbogs, but you, like, only let them be druids. It'd be kind of funny. Like, they have, like, a super restrictive race class. For most people, I think for most cases, you can really expand race class combinations. If you do add high elves in, if you don't let them be warriors, I'm going to stab you in the eye. Like, what the hell? It's so annoying it's really annoying when you have race class combinations that make perfect sense and don't exist. That's what is really annoying, I think. Kind of like, why can't this race be a warrior? Why can't this race be a rogue? It doesn't make any goddamn sense. I feel like those are some of the simplest things. Like, there's not much code. Like, in general, that's just tweaking a few values, right? Adding a couple things. Um, Adding the item clarity on how a lot of procs work. So just making that all in the tooltip as opposed to people having to test it and put it on Wowhead. Just put it in the tooltip. If nothing else, just put it in the tooltip. And for a lot of more novel effects like cast Shadow Bolt on hit, um, like I said, just make it something that's actually where someone can actually understand how to use it while leveling. So make it either an on use short cooldown or put some sort of obvious way in the tooltip to know how it's going to use so people can actually account for it. As far as dungeons go, again, dungeon raids, I bet you could just drastically lower the amount of trash, and if you need to, just increase the amount of XP you get from bosses, which would also compel people to want to do the bosses, even if they're kind of far away from each other. Just buff some of the dungeon gear that's bad throughout the leveling process so that there isn't so many dead items in a lot of raids. And so you're much more inclined, again, to want to do all the bosses in the raid or dungeon, I mean. Let's see. And yeah, and you could probably make some of the trash more difficult too. I wouldn't be against buffing some of the dungeon bosses. You have to be careful with this though, because a lot of classic dungeons or dungeons, yeah, they exist on a level spectrum. So, for example, Dead Mines, the beginning of the dungeon is a very different level from the end of the dungeon. So you basically don't really need to buff the end of the dungeon because most people are going to Dead Mines at like level 20 to something, and then the end of the dungeon is already hard as hell just because of the higher level. So you don't really need to buff that, right? It's more like, yeah, make sure the first boss does something else. Again, I like the idea of going around and trying to add as much clarity to the game. So I would really look at that add-on that basically told people what mobs do and try to get that in. I imagine trying to make more raid mechanics much more obvious to people looking at them might be one of the harder things to do. So maybe that's not really plausible, but I would love to see that. Because I think anything that stops people from having to alt tab or read something up, the more things that are just obvious in the game, especially if you don't have to spell them out, they're just cued visually and by gameplay, is kind of the best place to be. But and then you can, without adding quests or even really changing them, just any quests that are long and kind of awkward, give them better rewards at the end. Like the Stalvin Mistmantle quest, just make it better. Just buff the rewards, you know? If I'm gonna run all over Azeroth and be inefficient with stuff, then give me a better reward. With crafting, without adding a single new item, all you really have to do is go to all the existing items and tweak them a bit. And I don't that couldn't possibly be that hard. You're just changing values on existing items. That can't possibly be super crazy, right? Like, there's no way. So I would just go through all the stuff you can craft at lower levels and be like, look, let's just change it so that, oh, this is this level of gear. Well, let's make sure all the materials that are needed to craft it are within that level of zone. I don't, why should this guy have to be 5-10 levels higher in mining iron ore to make this level of item? This doesn't make any sense, right? Probably reduce the amount of items that require cross, like most of the items that need some kind of material from another profession, you should probably just either get rid of that, or that item better be really goddamn good. Like really goddamn good. But in general, or you might want to put some alternate means of acquiring that stuff. I get wanting to have that. I just feel like that kind of social interaction in the game has never really panned out very well. So that's not one I would really want people to lean on. Let's see here. Oh yeah, basically do a lot for the drop rates on a lot of questing items. Those I think are some of the most obnoxious pain points in the game, especially on like new release. It's just insane. And especially if you could make it to where it works better for parties, I think that'd be great. Anything to encourage people to play not just solo, but with like 2, 3+ people, I think is great because again, I think it's a blast to play that way, and it encourages people to just link up and quest together. Like, just imagine for a minute if it made way more sense for you when you go to the Fargo Deep Mine at low level to just group up and be in a group of 3, right? Um, oh God, you guys remember those lines to kill Goldtooth? Oh man, I mean that is a specific problem to um, very specific problem to launch. But God, that stuff was hilarious, wasn't it? In hardcore, it was so funny to watch. Let's see here. Yeah, some of that questing item stuff. Oh yeah, back to crafting. Yeah, you probably don't have to add a single new item to the game if you just tweak all the numbers on the existing ones. You could just, a lot of them can just be buffed the hell out of. A lot of them is like, hey, just make the rewards at the end of that quest line way better. Let's say all the recipes you can make from the Thorium Brotherhood. A lot of these are just way underpowered. Just buff the hell out of them. Pretty much true of all crafting recipes across the board. That's without adding a single new one. Even though I think you would get a lot more bang for your buck too by spending a lot of time on crafting, because I think that's, again, probably one of the things that was the best about TBC. That's a lot of that people love in the game and has often just been completely ignored, and I still don't get why. I really don't. And part of it is, again, like, you don't need to nerf engineering. Just make everything else better. Make people want to actually participate in these other professions and give them things that actually do close the gap on engineering. It's fine if engineering edges it out. Just find ways to let it close the gap a bit. I think you get so much more out of that. Oh, totally fine, I think, to have meeting stones let you summon people. That's totally cool. Maybe if anything, you also make it so warlocks can only need one person to help them summon, because then now that'll make the summoning services so much cheaper, because they won't have to own 3 accounts, right? That's, I feel like that's some pretty good stuff right there. Yeah, and then I just wanted to briefly mention when I've heard some breakdowns of the WoW survey, and I don't know about anyone else, but what I heard on the WoW survey made me think, okay, none of this really sounds like people who really understand Classic wrote this survey. So I don't know who wrote the survey, but I just feel like based on that, I'm not very excited for the direction it's going to go, and I'm almost certainly not going to be playing it. I'd almost certainly at that point prefer to just be playing a Classic fresh, if I'm being honest with you. I'd probably prefer that. So I was a little worried about that, and I did also want to take a moment to how do I put this? I obviously have strong opinions about problems in WoW's lore, and as I've written before, like I understand like the difficulties of writing an like they have to make an expansion, they have to make the actual content, like the digital assets that are going to be used in these things. They have to construct these zones and these dungeons, and they need an arbitrary reason why you have to go and kill some big monster and whatever. So there's some serious constraints to their writing that's really tough. And then they had to deal with the existing lore, and whoever was in charge of the lore was like, no, you have to do this or that, right? What I really hope with Classic is that if there was anything I would say, I'd be like, go to the tabletop version of the game you guys wrote back for like 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. Look through a lot of that lore and get some inspiration from that. And I would really say Classic Plus should really think of themselves as a totally different timeline. I would even go so far as to be like, maybe don't think about the greater cosmology you guys add later in terms of like inspiration you're looking for some of the new content you might be adding. I really think with Classic Plus, you have the opportunity to go in a very different direction with the lore and not make some of the really, really dumb mistakes that were made later, which in large part, again, they're under serious constraints. So I don't think the people writing are bad at what they do or stupid. Um, I just think you have kind of an impossible task. So again, you have time now. You have time. So don't I really think they should say like this is almost a completely alternate universe. Even if they in many ways look very similar, Classic Plus should really be viewed as like this can be a very alternate universe in the same way like comics will do different timelines that aren't just like things changed from this point on. They can be very different universes, right? So I really think Classic Plus should be viewed as like we're going to do very different things here. You know, no Shadowlands. Um, Maybe we'll completely change how the Titan lore works. We can completely change so many things if we really want to. We don't have to be wed to any of that. So I would really suggest thinking in terms of like if I was to say anything to Blizzard, it's like let's give them some serious freedom here and let's really go back to those old school vibes and try to exist in that world as opposed to what ended up happening in retail. You should really, and I know a lot of people say they don't really care that much about the lore, and this is one of those things where I'm like, you might not have cared about the lore, right? But for example, when people watch Star Wars, even if you weren't that into the lore, the mistake of undermining the whole setting by, for example, having this thing where you just shot a ship at light speed at another, that's the kind of the equivalent of like someone pulling out a gun in a medieval setting and just shooting someone in the head and being like, where'd you get that? Where did that come from? This was otherwise a fantasy. Where did that come from, right? Which is a strained metaphor in a fantasy world that has guns. But you know what I mean? Like it's like, well, why weren't you using that before, right? Now everyone's stupid and looks and doesn't make any sense, right? I think there's things like this that people aren't actively thinking about, but still undermine your buy-in to the world and break your immersion, even if you're not. And that's how I think some stupid lore ends up being. I'll be honest. There's a lot of TBC, even though TBC I like it and vanilla I like it. I still think there's a lot of stupid lore. I still think the Sunwell. If you guys look into the story of what happened during the Sunwell and Calicos dating that, I can't even. It's so dumb. I hate it so much. It's so stupid. And there's stuff like that all the time. And I'm like, with Classic Plus, this is really, in my opinion, a time to say, hey, we can do different things with the lore. We don't have to have time travel that breaks all of the. We can create if we're going to have time travel, we can create rules and stick to them that don't destroy the setting. You know what I mean? I would just suggest maybe taking some time to think that through. Because I personally think, first of all, a lot of people do care about the lore to at least some extent. They do like the characters and stories. And even people who don't think they care about the lore, I still think it affects them even if they don't actively think about it. And I'll just take the fact that WoW has plummeted so much as like, hey, obviously we can't separate all the variables and what happened and why retail, no one likes it anymore. Like, sure, there's some people that do, but it's fallen off a cliff in a lot of ways. Well, again, there's multiple factors to it, and I think that that's one of them and shouldn't be completely ignored. All right, I think that more or less wraps up what I'm thinking about. I probably could go on for more hours but I'd have to sit. I really need to sit down and break down. It would be a much more granular breakdown of things, items and stuff that I would like to see. Or I'd have to sit down and really think through how I think talent trees should work. And that would probably take me a few hours ahead of time to put together. So maybe at some point I'll do that. But honestly, just finding the time to record this long of something is really hard in my life right now. So I'll just leave it at that for now. And feel free to eviscerate me. I don't care. You're not going to hurt my feelings. The only thing that's going to hurt my feelings is if Classic Plus ends up sucking balls. It'll hurt my feelings a little bit, but not that much. All right. See you guys later.